Thank you to the Story Plant for letting me be part of the inaugural Behind the Book Jacket book club. I'm here to talk a little bit about the Heebie-Jeebie Girl. So first thing I need to tell you, every word of this book is true, except for the parts that I made up. And I've got some notes, so I'm going to try not to look down too much, but there's stuff I want to tell you that I don't want to forget. So, I would venture to say that every writer, imbues some part of their own life in everything they write. Certain characters or certain events have an effect on you, and they come up in your writing. We're writers. This is our jam. With the Heebie-Jeebie Girl, I took things a little bit further. The crux of the novel is actually based on a real life incident from my family. Much of the novel takes place in a neighborhood called Smoky Hollow in Youngstown, or what was the neighborhood in Youngstown. And it features a number of characters who may or may not resemble some of my relatives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the risks and rewards inherent in writing about real life, and then maybe we can talk about the book. So the Heebie-Jeebie Girl is set in 1977 Youngstown, and it is the closest I've ever come to writing historical fiction. And I do need to add that it is kind of terrifying to think that I have now lived through something that could be qualified as historical fiction. So the story revolves around a little girl with a talent for picking the daily 3-digit lottery number. And when her grandmother is robbed of her lottery winnings, she and her great uncle kind of venture off into Youngstown to try to find the perpetrators. So I can tell you that much of that above synopsis is true. My family is from Youngstown. My parents and most of my older siblings were born there. One brother and I were the only ones who were actually born in Cleveland. Spent a lot of time in Youngstown. It's kind of like my second home. And there was a period way years and years ago when one of my younger cousins did go through this period of where she picked the daily number a lot. She was, I think, like 5 or 6 at the time, and her mom, my aunt, and our mutual grandmother won a lot of money playing the daily number when she picked the number. When I was writing the book, I had a wonderful correspondence with my Uncle Ed, my mom's younger brother. He is actually one of the few characters who appears by name in the book with his permission. And we corresponded a lot via email, and I asked him what he remembered about the lottery numbers. I want to share a little bit of one of his emails, just to give you an idea. And also, when he refers to N, that is the name of the little cousin that was picking the numbers. And when he refers to Uncle Ed, that is my great Uncle Ed, his uncle. You know how in certain families, like similar names come up over and over and over? In our family, it's Ed. A side note, if you are a writer, I would say don't give characters the same names unless it's a plot point or you're writing like a sprawling Russian novel. So in real life, Uncle Ed, my great Uncle Ed, had a name change. So part of my uncle's reply read, "My mom and Uncle Ed would log all the winning numbers on a daily basis. Every day, and I mean every day, Uncle Ed would go to the McGuffey Mall on the east side and buy lottery tickets. I don't think they ever missed a day. If for some reason Uncle Ed couldn't go, they would have a neighbor by the only name I knew him by, Stinky Eddie, buy the tickets. He got his name because he did stink, never took a bath. If N gave out a number for the day, they would double down on the number. It was crazy. One day, N gave my mom a number, and Uncle Ed and her bet about $5 on one number. I was at the tennis club that night and happened to see the drawing on TV. I couldn't believe it. I called home and they were hysterical. They won about $2,500. That solidified her name as the Heebie-Jeebie Girl." So, $2,500 in one pop is pretty decent scratch, especially when you are, this was in the early 80s. And like I said, Grandma really did win a lot of money, and she really was robbed of her lottery winnings. So those events were the seed that grew into the Heebie-Jeebie Girl, the novel, not the Heebie-Jeebie Girl, my cousin, who is now a lawyer. So the actual events happened in the early 1980s. I chose to set the novel in 1977 Youngstown because that was sort of the tipping point for the city of Youngstown. On September 19th, 1977, aka Black Monday, the Youngstown Sheet and Tube closed and threw 500 people out of work overnight. If you remember the 2019 closing of the Lordstown GM plant and how that decimated the area, multiply that by 5, and you get an idea of just how of the effect. And it wasn't just economic. It really did a number on the city's psyche. Plus, the winter of 1977, 1978 was brutal, with a snowstorm that actually figures prominently in the book that in January of 78. That was the worst blizzard in 40 years. So it is convenient when natural disasters do align with the story that you're trying to tell. So rather than setting the story when it actually happened, I said it in 1977 because that just seemed to raise the stage for all the characters and for the city. So the lottery numbers and the ensuing robbery always troubled me. I wondered, who did that? Why did they do that? My grandmother was unharmed, but they took all of her money. And not just the money she won playing the lottery. There is that generation who lived through the Great Depression who didn't trust banks and they kept their money at home. My grandmother was one of those people. So she wasn't generally trusting of strangers. God forbid if you brought home a boyfriend that wasn't Catholic or Slovak, but she was kind of trusting of authority. But more on turning real life family members into fictional characters later. The final draft of the Heebie-Jeebie Girl, well, the first draft rather, of the Heebie-Jeebie Girl, pretty much laid out the story as it happened, or at least as I remember it. And I'm sure some of my siblings or cousins may have a different memory, and if they do, they are welcome to write their own novel. One of the risks inherent in writing about real life is somebody is bound to say that's not how it happened. So go write your own book. This was my interpretation of it. Anyhow, I wrote the story as it happened, and it kind of stank. It had no life. It stank like Stinky Eddie from Smoky Hollow. I had to learn probably the cardinal rule of writing about real life, which is just because it happened in real life doesn't mean it has to happen in the book. Plus, there were big questions that need to be answered, like how did this little kid pick all the winning lottery numbers? I asked my cousin, the original Heebie-Jeebie Girl, who had successfully picked all those numbers, and she actually did have an email and an answer. In an email, she wrote in part, I didn't feel like I was guessing. I felt like I was telling the numbers what they were going to be. Seriously, maybe now I would say I was tapping into some other knowledge, but at 5 or 6 years old, I felt like, yeah, I can make that happen if you want, end quote. Children's egos are expansive and delightful. And if you haven't learned the laws of physics yet, maybe they don't apply to you. So originally, I had the character tell the numbers to get in line, the way a precocious 7 going on 8-year-old might tell all the older adults in the family, we're going to draw rainbows and I'm going to be the judge. I mean, that's what precocious 7-year-olds do. But in the fictional world, that wasn't enough. You can't just have luck. The only dramatic thing about luck is the question of when it's going to run out. So there needs to be something more. I don't want to talk too much about the book in case you haven't read it, and I don't want to give out too many spoilers. Suffice to say, I found a solution that I think added depth to the character and set up other events in the book. No matter if your characters exist in a very concrete real world or in an imaginary landscape, you always need to look at what works, what's going to raise the stakes for the characters and what events are going to transform the characters. So now writing about real places has a long history in literature. You think of, James Joyce and Dublin, or Mark Twain and Mississippi, or Amy Tan and San Francisco, or John Updike and New England. So people do it. And there is a certain delight in dropping in, the name of a real street or a real restaurant or the revolving Schwabel's bread billboard. There's a delight for the reader in recognizing those details. And, also, I think it gives the narrative authenticity and specificity and flavor. Obviously, locations aren't always convenient for what your characters have to do or where they're going. Sometimes you have to fudge a little bit with real life geography. My first 2 novels are set in contemporary Cleveland, and while I name drop real places in those books as well. Sometimes you do need to play fast and loose with real geography in order to give your characters time to get to, drive to work or get someplace while they're having a conversation. In an email from my uncle, he mentioned that there was a bar at the end of Audubon Street where my grandmother's house was that was called the Tip Top, that was run by a guy named Angelo. And when you have a good bar name and a good proprietor name, why make that up? So Angelo and the Tip Top do appear by name in the book, as does the Mahoning Valley Restaurant, or MVR, which is still in business. If you are ever in Youngstown, want a good Italian meal, check out the MVR. It's legendary. Now, the Heebie-Jeebie Girl was set more than 40 years ago. So, over time, stuff changes. Buildings change, streets move, buildings get torn down. The house where my grandmother lived is no longer there. You could even argue that the neighborhood is no longer there. The house where my grandma was is now part of a parking lot for a Youngstown State University dormitory. So, I use a combination of memory and old maps, old and new, to piece together the geography of the Heebie-Jeebie Girl. And like my other books, it does have a combination of real locations and imagined. And as I was writing, I kept thinking about what the city of Youngstown would have to say about all these changes within her borders. I had always imagined the novel as having 3 narrative voices. And sometime around the 3rd draft, I actually added a 4th section with in the voice of the city of Youngstown. And it just didn't work. It felt like an add-on. But I really, really love the idea of having the city being one of the storytellers. I mean, if you want an omniscient narrator, who better than a city? The city sees everything. But I didn't want to rewrite the book with Youngstown telling the entire story because, 1, I'm lazy, and 2, I really, really loved the voices that I created. While I was writing this, I was reading Dan Shawn's Ill Will and Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad. If you haven't read those, they're magnificent writing. And they both play with the way the narrative looks on the page. And I started thinking about that. I was like, well, what if there's a different way to interject Youngstown's voice? So now she comments on the action and the characters through text boxes that are interspersed throughout throughout the text. It's a different way of looking at the narrative. And yes, Youngstown is a she. I picture her as like the funky old crone sitting next to you at the bar, like caging cigarettes and free drinks off of people and telling stories about everybody in the bar. Like I said earlier, every writer plagiarizes real life and real people for their material. You just do. Maybe it's the way your neighbor saunters out to get the Sunday paper in his bathrobe and slippers, or the person in front of you at the grocery store buying 52 cans of cat food and 3 frozen dinners, or your coworker's voice, but you pull from real life. In the Heebie-Jeebie Girl, I did take it a step further because it is written based on family history. So some of the characters are directly based on real family members. And at a certain point, there is a certain metafictional conundrum of, if you are writing about real family members and you are a member of that family, do you put yourself into the book? Kind of like how Alfred Hitchcock would famously put himself into some of his, to every one of his movies somewhere. I'm not in the book, but when Hope, the titular character, mentions her cousins from Cleveland, I'm one of those cousins. So I guess I'm fine in there. Now, obviously, the reward and risk of this is the same. Somebody is bound to ask, is that me? And I guess my advice to you, if you're ever in this situation, is to say, sure, it's you, unless you don't want it to be. Some people want to be in the book, even if they're a villain. Some people want to be in the book only if they're the villain. I guess my advice would be never use real names without permission. Like I said, Uncle Ed, my real Uncle Ed, Baby Eddie, is the only character in the book by name, and that is with his permission. Otherwise, it's always wise to disguise them, change their gender, and they'll never recognize themselves. Trust me. Now, a smaller, very personal reward for basing characters on real people is revenge. So petty, yes. Satisfying, also yes. So, if it makes you feel the tiniest bit better to say, or vindicated to base like the snotty little girl on, give her the first name of your elementary school nemesis, go ahead, do it. Revenge is a dish best served cold, and nerdy bookish girls really do like their dishes served cold. So one of the central characters in Heebie-Jeebie Girl is based on my great uncle Ed, who really did live in the garage. And in the book, he became Great Uncle Joe. And the character of Dolores is based on my maternal grandmother. Now, I didn't know her or my great uncle Ed as well as I would like to. My family visited Youngstown often, but we seemed to spend more time at my father's family than my mom's. I don't know why. I will say that sometimes my grandmother was a difficult woman. Life did throw her a lot of curveballs. The difficulties meant that she has in the book are all stuff that she really did deal with in real life, and probably more. One of the unexpected rewards rather, of writing about her and my great uncle Ed was the chance to get to know them better. I got to commune with them in my imagination, and it was different than you said it with your older relatives and listen to stories, and maybe you hear the same stories over and over. When you write about real people, especially ones that have gone before, you get to create a new mythology for them. You get to create new stories for them while still maybe getting to know them a little bit better. So both my grandmother and my great uncle Ed are gone, long dead, but I feel like I gave them a chance to live on in the Heebie-Jeebie Girl. And I'm really happy to have a chance to introduce you to some of my family. Thanks for reading. And I'm happy to talk about the book or answer questions if people have questions.
I've got tons of questions.
Go.
Although you, some of them, I mean, one of the things that really struck me was that you made Youngstown a woman, the city a woman, because my knowledge of Youngstown is basically Bruce Springsteen's song, which was going through my head quite a lot while I was reading the book. And I have to ask, did you name Bobby because he of all the characters, he's the one who I think really stepped out of a Bruce Springsteen song. And Bruce Springsteen is always singing about guys named Bobby. I once wrote a hero who was based on a Springsteen song, and I named him Bobby. So I'm curious about Bobby and Springsteen.
Okay, so two things. There's this great recording of Springsteen live at Stambaugh Auditorium in Youngstown. It was doing a acoustic version of Youngstown. And there was a period when every time I would sit down to write, I would listen to that to put me in that place, and then I'd write. Bobby, I'm trying to think of how I came up with his name. I think I was just kind of going for a more generic. My guess, in my head, he went to St. Columba, which was more like where the UK people, the Irish and English immigrants would have gone. That's what my uncle said. So I kind of try to give him more of a, I don't know, an Anglo name. But with Bobby's voice, in my head, whenever I heard him talk, he sounded like the actor Bruno Kirby. Do you remember him?
I remember him,
he sounded like, if you read Bobby's part out loud and imagine it in Bruno Kirby's voice, or when you're reading it, it takes on a whole new dimension.
I have to reread the book now.
There you go.
I didn't hear him as Bruno Kirby. I heard him as Bruce Springsteen. I'm sorry.
That's okay too. That's okay too.
I pictured him as Bruce Springsteen. He looked like Bruce Springsteen. But cool. I don't want to monopolize this whole discussion, but to me, he was the most tragic character in the book. I mean, yeah, the grandmother, Dolores, dies and the family loses their matriarch, but to me, he was the one who was most torn between good and evil, who I mean, I'm really in awe of how sympathetic you made this thug. So if you want to talk about that at all, please feel free.
Thanks.
I'll shut up now.
No, I appreciate that, because that's, a part of this was like trying to work through that. I mean, obviously you said you've read it, so my grandma, that really is how they robbed her. That scam. But she was not injured. But I often wonder, like, what kind of chutzpah does it take to show up at somebody's house and impersonate the water department guys and go in and rob somebody? And I just wondered about who those guys were. What were they thinking? Why? I don't know. I wondered and wondered and wondered. So I kind of wanted to create maybe it was my way of just saying, well, it doesn't excuse what they did, but I want to see the mitigating circumstances that made him do it. And was talking to the writer Mary Doria Russell, who lives in Cleveland and who's kind of a mentor. And she's like, oh yeah, it's like Crime and Punishment in Cleveland and Youngstown. I'm like, oh yeah, a little bit. So, and kind of I started thinking that also, just that comment kind of maybe start thinking in a different way about the book, because I did want him to be, I don't know, I've been told many times that I'm very kind to my characters, and I guess I am. I mean, even if I kill them, I kill them softly. And I guess I wanted to see, one, if I could make him somewhat sympathetic. And I guess it was my own way of trying to understand why someone might do something like that. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. You made him very sympathetic. And that was, for me, at least, that was one of the huge tugs of the book, was just how, I mean, his whole section, I read it in one gulp, it was, he was such a pathetic and struggling character, so yeah, I thought he was wonderful.
Thank you. Other questions, or we can talk more about Springsteen, whatever.
John.
Hi, Elizabeth. Hi.
Just a quick question. I am utterly fascinated by how much real stuff you put into this book. It's something that I have never tried. Are all your books like that?
No.
Granted, I've only read 2 others.
So for Throw Like a Woman, there is a lot of reality in that. People are like, so are you really a upset single mom? Like, no, I have a very nice husband. I do have a kid who sometimes bothers me. And like Throw Like a Woman is more like my fantasy, because I was one of those little kids. Little girls have the dream of growing up and playing in the major leagues too, and that was always my dream. So I was like, how could I get there? Maybe like this. So this is definitely the most realistic, if you can call a book that also has magical realism and a talking city realistic. But it's so much is based on my memory and family lore and family histories. It kind of was a perfect storm of. So now I would say no, not all of my books are like this, but I do try to base them in real places. And I've noticed I have a thing about chronology in my books, if that makes any sense. That and women and girls doing unusual things. But I think this is definitely the one with the most real fact, place-based, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Sure.
Maybe? Okay.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating concept to me. I don't think I could even try that.
Really? Well, how come?
I don't know the
I
answer.
don't have to put you on the spot, but
the really long fantasy that I wrote that Lou knows about, longish. I started out by basing the main characters. Yeah. A lot of them are very short words, and I use some of them more than once, so it's not as bad as it sounds.
Mhm.
But I started by basing the main characters on people I knew and some of the friends I had in college.
Mhm.
But by the time I was a chapter or 2 in, I don't think they would have recognized themselves even a little bit. I had originally actually used their names, but even that I wound up changing the names for thematic reasons.
Sure.
So whatever elements, now the place is that I totally get. I base on places I know or places I've been. But I've never really taken real people that I know and turned them into myth or fiction. That's just utterly fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, and I think that, like, for instance, the lead character's best friend in Throw Like a Woman is definitely based on a very close friend. And she was like, "Oh my God, that's me." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's fine." And one of the characters in Super Ladies is absolutely based on a very dear friend and her husband, and she loved that it was based on her. Like, she totally loved it. So it's actually, she was based on Margie. So, and she's like, yeah, we get it all the time. This is good. So she really liked that character. So I think, like, with every character, like, sometimes it just gives you a basis, like doing one of those writing exercises where they're like, okay, write down the first paragraph of this short story or this novel, and then and that you've never read before, and then and then continue writing it in your own words, like what you think will happen. It's like a writing exercise. So, like you're saying, John, it kind of, you take that as that basis, and then the character morphs into someone else. And I think it gives you a good starting point.
So it can be a form of therapy also.
Yes, it can. And it honestly, the work in progress now is, I'm trying not to make it therapy, but it is loosely based on my family. It's about a family of musical prodigies and the one kid who isn't one. But I think it is also about, maybe not feeling like you fit in. And I think that's something that everyone can relate to. So that is one of those things where, yes, these characters are gonna evolve and become who they are. Some of them may bear resemblance to someone in my family, and that's fine. When you have a large family, you can have, like, the dead to me list of people you don't talk to anyway, so who cares? I know it sounds horrible and flippant, but honestly, if you change the gender, no one recognizes themselves. Serious.
I think it was Christmas time. I read one of Lou's books. When You Went Away, is that the right title, Lou?
Yes, it is.
And I've read some of Lou's other books, and this was the only one where I could not hear the narrator as anything other than Lou's voice. And there was so much Lou permeating that character that I literally I couldn't see past that being Lou.
And yet not a single word of that novel is from my life.
Oh yeah, I know.
Well, it was actually that was an agent friend.
But metaphorically, it was though.
It was an agent friend. He was also my agent, who said to me, you've got to be willing to put more of yourself on the page. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do it in a completely fictional way.
Except that the emotion was real, because
yes, the emotion was definitely all mine. The emotion was all mine.
And the cooking and the baseball.
Yes, but I never cooked those dishes. And it was a fictional New York Yankees team.
That's right, because you had Ronald Acuna Jr. playing for the Yankees.
As it turns out, yes.
No, but I brought that up because it was sort of the opposite of what Susan's done, in that she's taken literal events and literal people, and you've taken, and again, I've read a lot of your novels that have male viewpoints, for lack of a better word, that don't sound like you. And Susan only put herself in as a unnamed cousin. So I guess what I'm trying to get a long way around to asking is, how much of Susan comes across in these novels?
More in other ones than this one. Although a lot of what Youngstown has to say probably also my thoughts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I heard you all over Throw Like a Woman.
Yeah, now that you've gotten to know me, yeah, probably, yeah.
But Throw Like a Woman was the first book we worked on together, so
Sure.
This is
And
this
then
is
somebody like,
retrospective.
oh, that's her. Yeah.
I really liked the fact that you like did base it on your own character, on like people that you knew though, but like rewrote the story. Like I feel like a lot of people do that in their head, like continue like what they think's what's going to happen and all that kind of stuff, but not a lot of people get around to actually like writing it down or putting it into some way. And I found that really interesting.
Thanks. Yeah, it was one of those weird things that kind of kicked around in my head. And it's funny because like, Facebook is one of those weird things because you like come in contact with people that you haven't seen for a long time or relatives that like you met once or twice at a reunion, and then you get to know them in a different way. And I remember writing about Heebie-Jeebie Girl and like some distant cousin go, oh yeah, I kind of remember that. And it's just how it takes on different significance for different members of the family. And my cousin, the original Heebie-Jeebie Girl, we had a long talk about this because I was like, do you mind if I write about this? And she was okay with it. But for her, there's some other stuff because my aunt died. Her mom passed away when she was a kid. And so originally I had that happening. I'm like, whoa, wait, that's too much. That's too much. One, it didn't work dramatically. And two, I'm like, it felt like not cannibalistic, like just mean. I don't want to be mean spirited. And also it didn't work for the book.
Yeah.
A friend of mine actually who grew up in Youngstown was like, no, grandma's got to go down. But yeah, you have to draw that line of, if you're writing about people anybody who's still alive and you want to stay on their good side, maybe don't include X. And again, it's like, I try to use those real characters as a springboard.
Exactly.
Susan, can I ask you a little about one of the things that I really related to in this book was the class rising from generation to generation. And this is mostly because of my husband's family, they're Eastern European Catholics, Byzantine Rite Catholics who all worked in oil refineries in Perth Amboy, similar sort of milieu. And each, my husband was the first one in his family to go to college. And, his cousins mostly went to college. His aunts and uncles did not. And our kids have all, gone on to professional schools and stuff. And I sort of sensed, a bit of that in your book too, where Uncle Joe and Dolores were true blue collar working people. The next generation, Hope's parents' generation, seemed to be a step up professionally. And as I was reading it, I was saying, and Hope is going to become a lawyer, as it turns out.
Yes, yeah.
But
He works
I'm
for the
wondering
public defender's office.
Yeah, how you felt about that while you were writing it. I mean,
That is definitely something that I think maybe it wasn't a conscious decision, but that is something that I did see in my family, especially like with my mom's family, because Smoky Hollow, I mean, it had its name because one of my mom's jobs when she was a kid really was sweeping the the steel dust off the front porch in the mornings because they were near one of the mills and that spewed crap into the air and it did settle onto your front porch. So it wasn't until I got older that I realized they really kind of grew up kind of dirt poor. And it was like one of those things where maybe not dirt poor, but they were barely keeping it together. And yeah, my grandfather really was one of those guys who went off for a few years, came back, got grandma pregnant, went off for a few more years. Especially during the Depression. He rode the rails, he followed, he followed the horses, as they say, he bet on horse racing, and apparently he did play minor league ball. So he wasn't there. And there was like, I think I was like a teenager and I was like, my mom is the adult child of an alcoholic. Who knew? Like, you don't even think about all these things. And it wasn't until like I got older and talking to my cousins that we're all like, yeah, it's really amazing what the 4 kids in that family accomplish, given where they grew up. And it really is amazing that my great grandparents, who actually did grow up, who had immigrated from Slovakia, who grew up in the same house with my mom, and her mom, and actually her layabout dad really did valued education. And they're like, you're going to school. And I remember my mom, going to like the equivalent of community college to get an education. She wanted to be a writer and an editor remember in one of her scrapbooks, there's this letter of, a rejection letter of just saying, we're not going to hire you, but maybe get some college and this and that. And she did. It took her a while, took her until she was in her 60s to get her BA, but she went to college and got a little more college. Yeah, it is amazing to me how they managed to make that step up. And actually on my father's side too, most of my great uncles and my grandfather all worked for the Youngstown Sheet and Tube. My paternal grandfather worked for the Sheet and Tube for 43 years. I'm pretty sure my dad was the first one in his family to go to college. I know my paternal grandmother left school when she was 14, when she got out of 8th grade, and went to work as a typist for the New York Central Railroad. So yeah, there's a big jump there. And it's funky because when I have a 15-year-old daughter and I think about, I can't imagine her going to work every day as a typist. I mean, it's just like, you think about the 14-year-olds now, they're like, you're not going to do that. So I don't think it was a conscious decision, but it definitely was something that kind of clouded in a fog that was always part of writing about my family and thinking about that family.
It struck very, very true. That that was another thing I loved about the book.
Thank you. Other questions or anything else maybe we want to talk about?
Thanks for doing this. I'm definitely a Susan fanboy, so it was great to hear you talking about this stuff.
He says that in private too.
No, you leave that part in. I need it recorded. I need fanboy. Need more fanboys. Thank you, John. I appreciate that, man. But it is nice to see like the real people instead of just pictures.
Well, thanks for doing this, Susan. This is great, and we will
Thanks.
definitely be able to use this elsewhere. And
Good.
We've kicked this off now.
Yeah.
Starting now. It can only get bigger from here.
I think
And,
this is evidence that Storyplant has to host parties for its authors, and we could all get together and talk.
Well, I think
Wonderful.
that's part of what we learned here. We're gonna just keep this going on a regular basis, regardless of whether anybody else shows up. Next time we'll do it with wine though or something.
Yeah.
Yay, booze. No, but this is cool. I'm looking forward
looking
to
for cookies.
talking to John. Nice. I'm impressed. So you said, where is that field?
That's the Field of Dreams field.
Oh, that is the Field of Dreams. There, okay. I'm sorry. I know Lou's a Yankee fan, but I was really disappointed. I'm like, really? You get the Yankees to get to play there? That should have been like the Cubs and like, I don't know,
Well, the Cubs are doing it next year.
The White
Kansas
Sox
City or
was
something.
appropriate.
like it should have been like the Cubs in like Kansas City, or it should have been like a couple of Midwestern teams, not the
Well, the
Yankees.
White Sox, I mean, come on.
I'm not even
It's
sure
about
about
the White Sox.
Yeah, nobody
The-
counts the White Sox though.
Hey, Obama likes them, so that's good.
He does.
You know,
That's true.
good
That's
enough
true.
for me. And they didn't break my heart in 2016, so I'm fine with them. They're just rivals. That's fine. What else y'all want to talk about? There's time to go.
Got a million discussion questions if we want to answer any of them.
Yeah, well, save them. It's always, I don't know. I
Could always
have
do this again too.
there from like I've done some Zoom like book club, like get random emails from strangers saying, hey, do you have any discussion questions? So if you have other ones, send them to me. I'll add them to that list. I actually I did a online book club discussion with some book club in Tennessee that they read, somebody read the book. They originally from Youngstown, and do you have any discussion questions? I'm like, yes. Not only that, I'm desperate enough that I will talk to your book club. So
Same
please-
situation here.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have a longer list.
Yeah.
Well, everybody have a good night.
Thank you.
Okay,
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.